Good evening from India to all. This is Abhivardhan, and here we are with an interesting panel, which is the third panel in Glucon 2022. So, this is quote unquote not a panel, but I would say rather a dialogue with Rupak Chattopadhyay ji. So, Rupak ji is currently the president and CEO of the Forum of Federations in Canada. This organization works on political economy and, of course, aspects of policy and their economic considerations in terms. And I think Rupak ji would be in a much better position to explain and elucidate about the organization which he heads now. But I think let's come on to the discussion without wasting further time. So tonight we are going to discuss about India's sustainable economics from a perspective of its domestic infrastructure projects and how it affects the Indian political economy, and of course, how the government of India is contributing to the international projects, such as in the global South countries or in Eastern Europe or anywhere in the world. So, Rupak ji, welcome to Glacon, and it's a pleasure to host you.
Thank you very much, Abhivardhan. I'm very delighted to be here. As you noted, this was meant to be a panel where you would have multiple perspectives with people with sort of multiple backgrounds. So I'm sorry that you're stuck with me and you'll only get my view.
Well, I certainly wish that it would be a delightful experience. So, let's begin with a conversation. So, one thing which we generally see is that India has been quite vocal for the global South countries, and we see it when the negotiations for the 2015 Paris Accords went in. India was the key country which said, you know what, we just can't go with the Paris Accords like that if you just don't have the concept, if you don't even consider the idea of common but differentiated responsibilities in a reasonable manner. And this is something which has shaped the current union government's sustainable development approach. I'll say even the environment approach. So, while India is one of the, I think the only country in the world for now, I am not sure about the statistics, but I think the only country which has abided with the GHG emissions. I think GHG emissions are a very limited aspect of understanding India's sustainable development approach because there are many layers to it. It ranges from forest to urban development and others. So, under this government, the infrastructure projects have gone high. There's no doubt about it. States like Uttar Pradesh, which quote unquote used to be known as BIMARU, states, are actually having much better infrastructure projects in Purvanchal, in Noida, in Lucknow, in Varanasi, in Prayagraj, in other parts. So Uttar Pradesh is an interesting example. Bihar is also culminating with development. Assam is also having it. So how do you see the relationship between India's infrastructure projects and India's political economy's mature transformation, cutting the usual hype from what we hear in the media and what we hear from the political party? So, how do you see the transformation so far?
I think infrastructure is a very important part of economic development. And the reason for that is infrastructure brings certain externalities which are not possible if you don't have access. If you remember, as recently as the early 2000s, late 90s, you would have reports in the press about villages in places like UP being a number of several days walk from the nearest main road. And this is unfathomable that something like this would could happen in the heartland of the country. And I think successive governments in India have not given infrastructure the due importance that they should have many years ago. And infrastructure is not just about building glitzy road. It's about it's about having providing your population with access to services, schooling, healthcare, social services. But if people have to walk a day or day and a half to get to the nearest road to go to hospital, that has negative externalities for your economy, for the well-being of your population. So I think this belated focus on infrastructure is very important. It's also important from the point of view of domestic trade or international trade in terms of bringing goods to market, in terms of connectivity and movement within the country. But there's also a question of national integration. I mean, India is one country, but this is an issue in many other countries where, for years, the Northeast, for example, has been neglected. So if if indeed India sees the Northeast as an integral part of the country, there's no reason why there were no, there weren't multiple bridges over the Brahmaputra for decades. So these are things that should have been prioritized a long time ago. I you know you talked about GHG emissions and India's position on the Paris Accords, and I think again this is something where I don't think this is government specific. I think this is something that would have happened regardless of which government was in power. But I think India is seen very much in the global south as a model to emulate on many things. However, I think India's competitive advantage as a model is being fast eroded by other countries in the global south who have done much better in India over the decades in providing access to infrastructure, raising the standard of living of their people, so on and so forth.
That's quite interesting as a perspective made. And I think as quality of life is increasing, there will be a chance that we will go towards better considerations, in the urban portion of our country. And of course, when it comes to accessibility in the rural, I think we are seeing some leaps and bounds already. I mean, I can start with the Jal Jeevan Mission to Ujjwala and others. So, one thing which is a genuine consideration here is that when we look at India's economic policy, there's a general and genuine dichotomy which exists. Is that yes, there will be certain PSUs which might require privatization because there was no business of the government to be actually there. For example, Air India, which had to be anyways privatized and given back to the original owners, the Tatas.
Mhm.
But there are reliable companies which actually give a lot of revenue to the government. And often what happens is there is, and again, there's a policy churn. It depends on how it goes ahead. There's a policy churn happening on the question whether the government should privatize many of its PSUs, and if yes, then which sector wise. And as it looks at the entrepreneurial economy, the economy of startups, unicorns, and so on so forth, will it be enough to integrate the Indian population into the workforce of anything? Because we all know that IT sector jobs alone are not going to help people, or being just a lawyer or just a journalist as a job is not going to help it, or just being a scholar is not going to help. You need a lot of manufacturing jobs in the country to counter not just China, but also the negative implications of ossified economies, which are already there in the United States, for example. We already see that United States is suffering from deindustrialization, and due to that, um, entrepreneurial America is on a different verge. I'm not talking about that because I don't wish to digress, but I certainly have a genuine concern that India as an economy, of course, needs a free market and needs entrepreneurs, but at the same time, it needs to have a proper public backing, because it then goes to the very ugly question of whether we have enough IFS officers in the Indian Foreign Service, or we have enough income tax officers, or we have enough judges. But of course, that's the legal and the administrative part of it. But my question was more about like how to include people in the workforce, government based as well as private based. So manufacturing is the future. How do you see that?
You've packed a lot of things into your question. I think we need to take sort of a disaggregated view. First, I think the first aspect is that of urbanization, and I think India is certainly not unique in being a growing economy that is urbanizing very quickly. Given that there is a great deal of urbanization, given that value addition from agriculture is very low, obviously then goes to the point that there is going to be a jobs crisis in the country. But the problem, the big issue in India, as I see it as an outsider, is a mismatch between the kinds of jobs that are in demand and the kinds of skills that people are coming out with. So in India, everybody aspires to go to university. I think this is a misplaced approach. I do think in India, I know well, not I know from friends who work in industry that in India it's very hard, for example, to find a master welder. These very high skilled blue collar jobs, and because the educational system is not set up to supply that kind of expertise, you have a mismatch between what is needed in the workplace and what is coming out. I mean, I don't mean to deride people who have undergraduate degrees in the social sciences. I myself do have it, you can't you can't absorb these huge numbers of people who are getting undergraduate degrees in English literature or in political science or sociology. There isn't a job market for it. What you need are welders, plumbers, electricians, people who are trained to do this. And I think this is actually a huge problem, not just in India, but in many countries who have this what I would call university-based credential systems. I'll give you an example. During the debt crisis in Europe about 10 years ago, when you looked at unemployment figures, you saw that the countries that had the highest unemployment figures also had the highest number of people who graduated from universities. So I remember when the comparison people used to draw is between Spain and Germany, where in Spain almost 27% of graduates were unemployed at the height of the debt crisis because there were no jobs for them. Whereas in Germany, which is highly industrialized and which actually has a system of trade schools that provide practical education, people are employed. And unfortunately, in the the Anglo-American system, uh, we 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 have an almost classist view of university education against trades education, whereas in the Central European and the German system, both have equal value. And so, for example, in Germany, one of my former bosses was a mediator between the Deutsche Bahn, the German railway uh, train workers union, and the federal government on wage negotiations. And I asked him, so how do you fix these wages? He says, well, in Germany, railway workers make as much money as doctors because we entrust them with the responsibilities and the lives of so many people. So even though they come from different streams, have different types of credentials, their worth in the economy is as much. And so to the most of the point, people in India don't realize that if you're a master welder, you probably make more than you would make as somebody who's working in an equivalent position in IT. But there is no awareness, and there is a stigma to pushing people into trades. So that is something that has to be thought of. Another aspect of this is something I'm going to make reference to Ratin Roy. I don't know if you probably know Ratin. Ratin used to be the the former head of NIPFP and an advisor to the Planning Commission, and now is head of ODI. Ratin again said, look, says on a regular basis and writes about this, and I agree with him. Says, one of the problems in India is in terms of manufacturing, we are not manufacturing the sorts of things that our people need to consume. He says in India, we if you want to go and buy a 4,000 rupee shirt, you'll find a made in India shirt. But that's not what the vast majority of Indians are consuming. If people want to buy a 200 rupee shirt or a 400 rupee shirt in somewhere in Bihar or somewhere in the interiors of Madhya Pradesh, then the only thing they can buy is made in Vietnam or made in China products. So unless we get that side of it right, we're not going to generate enough jobs, not going to generate the right kind of value, and have a consumption, and trade pattern that harms the country. So this is something I think that Indian policymakers have to think about. Your third point about governance. Governance is very important because it's your governance that's going to actually the quality of your governance is going to have an impact on the kinds of policies you think about. And so one of the challenges in my professional capacity over the years, I've dealt with many administrative systems in many parts of the world, 20, 30 countries over the years. The thing that strikes me about India is the ossified nature of the administrative structure. It's very good at doing certain things. It's very poor at doing other things. So the Indian administrative structure is very good at responding to emergencies, for example. All right, it's very good in providing large scale services. What it's less good at is in conceptualizing and implementing innovative ideas. And And there are a lot of bright people, in administration, but the system is not set up like that. And there are far too few people within the system who are empowered to conceptualize and implement. If you go to any ministry, you'll find lots of people hanging around, who'll serve you tea, who'll carry Saab's bag and things like that, but not enough people beyond your sort of your joint secretaries and additional secretaries. But you need a whole host of individuals who are professionals, who are program managers, which simply doesn't exist. I mean, you know this better than I. Where I've heard, I don't know the exact figures, but I've read constantly that India has fewer diplomats than Singapore. And that when you're faced with a situation like that, that has implications for policy, and it has implications for the implementation of any policy that you might have. I mean, I'll give you an example here in Canada, where I am, and where again we work with government. This is also the Canadian administrative system is also an outgrowth of the former colonial system that we had in Canada. The only thing is that it has evolved with time, with differentiated layers of levels of responsibility depending on where you sit in the administrative structure. But what it has done is to actually bring in people who are specialized in certain sectors. So they're the ones who are the policy leads there. You have generalists who manage the system, but in India, the sense I have is outside of the economic ministries, commerce and finance, there aren't that many specialists who actually work within the administrative structure. Many years ago, a very dear friend of mine who retired as Secretary to Government of India said to me, he said, when I was in the Ministry of Defense, I was well known for drafting very good contracts. And I turned to him and I said, really? I said, in any other country, the job of drafting contracts would have fallen to the legal section of the ministry, not to the additional secretary. That's not a manager's job. It's a very highly specialized job. So these are some. So you have problems with. I think problems with governance is number one, because then that sets your priorities for everything else, and how you implement, what you implement, and how you implement. Sorry for rambling, Abhivartan. So,
No, I definitely agree on that point. And that if there are no priorities, how will you actually move ahead, and how will the cycle make the engine at the end of the day? Well, I would say wheels make the engine, and not, of course, we are driving out. But I mean, it's bad analogy. So that's actually a very interesting point made. So you might be aware of India's international projects, which is how India has invested outside its own country. So India has invested in the United Nations buildings. We know India has invested in poor countries in Africa. Let's not call them poor countries. Let's call them underdeveloped countries in Africa. Of course, the
some of these
investment.
countries have better social indicators in India.
Yeah,
So that's something to be remembered.
exactly. Yeah. So India has invested in Maldives also, or let's say committed to invest in Maldives. So uh, these projects have their own sense and value, and of course it makes India a very interesting and trust, I would say, worth to be trusted actor in the Indo-Pacific. But while the Chinese quote unquote gongos, which I call in that way, GONGOs, government oriented NGOs, while their investments are very large in Africa, and Turkish investment in Africa is also humongous, where does India's investment, not just in Africa but in other parts of the world, make India's value essential? I can also refer to India's humanitarian aid to the UNRWA agency, which is helping people in Palestine and Syria as far as their humanitarian concerns are there. India has definitely done that. And we know that India has equally good relations with Israel and Palestine, but more equal with Israel. So, in that regard, how do you see the course of time, as far as it has been the last 20 years? the infrastructure projects in which India has been investing so for long. And you may include also the role of the peacekeeping forces, but I think that comes into the question of hard power. So it's more of an economics question rather than a hard power security question. So how do you think?
This is not my area of expertise, but I mean, so I'll limit myself to saying that outside of India's immediate neighborhood, where India has very strong strategic interests, I think Indian support, whether it's investments in, hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure, is seen as something that is very welcome because it's usually untied, and it's not linked to a particular foreign policy position. So I work a lot in Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is full of Indian teachers and has been for at least the last 3 decades, where China is also now a very big player. So the Chinese impact you can see in terms of the infrastructure the Chinese building up, but there is still for Indians there has always been a lot of goodwill for because of the services they've imparted as teachers and doctors, and I think that's something to remember. So I'll limit it there. I mean, certainly India doesn't have the resources to invest that the Chinese do, and of course in India decision making is much slower. The Chinese can turn on a dime, and this is not a constraint that India is confronted by. There are other countries who also have slower decision-making processes, which certainly puts the Chinese at an advantage when it comes to these particularly to strategic investments in infrastructure and so hard infrastructure and soft infrastructure. So this is something again. India has both a resource constraint as well as a deficit in quick decision making.
Indeed, and I think this can be explored further as developments come in, and I think maybe we can have more discussions on this in future. So let's try to understand the China factor from a perspective of investment and the returns, because many a time it is claimed that the Belt and Road Initiative, which is run by China, and I'm bringing BRI here, from a perspective of how much profitable or worth revenue it is, because at the end of the day all of these infra projects are based on China's command, quote unquote, capitalist economy, which is itself quite different in its own way, because this is generally claimed that economies in East Asia have prospered and actually industrialized themselves as well as even expanded their economy through the public banks, such as the cooperative banks and other government related banks. So in India, we have Punjab National Bank, Punjab and Sindh Bank. We have Vijaya Bank. Now it is merged with Bank of Baroda. All of these kind of banks we have. But in India, what happened was that our political economy was very ossified because due to any reasons. I mean, I don't wish to get into the political part of it, but due to political leaders and other kind of factions, cooperative banks were subject to theft or any kind of corruption, and we saw that the same public institutions, financial institutions which we had of these kind, uh, they actually could not do the same in India in that sense. But um, of course, we can say that India as a democracy is a different democracy, of course, and of course there are implications of how you see administration. But leaving that part, uh, um, what value do you see for public financial institutions? And do you see things like small payment banks, which Airtel and Paytm have tried to do, or Bharat Pay is trying to do, or trying to achieve? Do you think that private banks will have a role there, or do you think that we really need proper public institutions? Because this is a comparison I wish to make from an honest perspective. Because number one, it is being predicted that China may be under subject to a middle income trap, and
Mm.
if that happens for China, India might have a little bit of advantage, because we always ignore this point, or sometimes we just completely forget it. It's just in a discourse. I'm saying that whatever is happening after COVID first wave, whatever happened, the economic implications as UNCTAD reports, and the break of the supply chains, whatever happened, we have to understand it is very, very humongously, I would say I will use this word very responsibly. It is humongously related to US China economic, technology, and to an extent, even knowledge relations. Because the US China relations, their implications, and of course, to an extent, Brexit. But I don't think Brexit has a big role to play because, again, the European market is a different thing altogether. But we can disagree on that, or you might have a different point, or maybe I might agree on a better point. So, Brexit's implications, I'm not seeing much right now because it depends. But when it comes to China-US relations, they howsoever Trump and Biden have been handling this, howsoever the administrations of both countries have been handling it, it has affected emerging middle economies like India. And this is why this question came into my mind. So it is in two parts. I understand there might be a lot to unpack. So
Okay.
would be very happy to
All
hear
right.
about
So
your take.
let me try and unpack. First, you asked about public institutions. I think in countries like India, public sector banks have very important role to play, because they can take investment risks that the private sector simply won't take. So I think there's a role for them. I don't think you need 2 dozen public sector banks, and I think scale is important in this context, and therefore I think that they're doing the right thing by merging the banks. And India is not the only country of sort of its kind with public sector banks. In Brazil, they have a very big public sector bank called Caixa, but it's one bank. It's one bank that has both a retail and investment function. And perhaps in India, maybe everything gets merged into SBI, State Bank of India, and that becomes where you have sort of an infrastructure arm. I think administratively, perhaps but that's not my place. But I think the bigger point is, economies are dynamic, and therefore what makes sense at one point in time may not make sense in a different point of time. You started with your point about Air India, which has now been privatized. People often forget that the reason that the Indian aviation sector was nationalized was because of the unviability and unprofitability of airlines that existed before to nationalization. And in fact, in the 1950s, it was these private airlines who asked to be nationalized in order to survive. If people are interested, there's a very nice book on the Indian aviation sector, slightly dated, written by Professor Baldev Raj Nair, who used to teach at McGill. Now late, dear departed. But anybody who wants to understand the logic of why this happened, I highly recommend. I can't remember the name of the book off the top of my head, but Baldev Raj Nair, excellent book. So that's that. On trying to before I come to the point of how whether India can benefit from the ongoing US China clash, there are two things to be noted. The Chinese have a couple of structural advantages over India. The first one is they have much greater state capacity. Okay, and state capacity reflected in in this case, in your tax to GDP ratio. Just look up the difference in tax to GDP ratio, and it'll give you a sense of how much more resources the Chinese government has at its disposal. Number one, that. Number two, its state capacity is also linked to its decision making process. Okay. Number three, they because of the nature of the Chinese economy, state-run capitalism or state capitalism. When the Chinese make investments in manufacturing, a Chinese manufacturer has to consider only two of the factors of production, which are the three factors for land, labor, capital. All right, they only have to think about labor and capital because the cost of land is free. It's because it's owned by the state. Whereas if you are an Indian private sector player, you have to consider these things. And in terms of scale, if you to put it very crudely, the only true private sector player in China is probably the hawker in the corner who's selling his wares, right? The big Chinese corporations are all government backed or government owned. So the scale of investments that they can make nobody can match. Forget about the Indians, the Americans, the Germans simply can't match it because they're not government backed entities, so they don't have those kinds of access. Now, in terms of to what extent India can gain from I mean, this is an open question, and it's an open question because there are deficits of governance in India, there are deficits of infrastructure, and there is a deficit of the right kind, which we started with, of skill set in industry. There's a real problem with the kind of trained industrial labor that you need. And this is the problem. You talked about the US at one level. I'll give you an interesting example. The US is a very highly unequal place. Depending on where you are in the US, you're either in a very progressive, very modern part of the world, or you're in a third world kind of setting. I mean, there are parts of the United States which feel more third world or more of a developing country than India does. And so, in about 20 years ago, some of the states in the South, states like Alabama and Mississippi, decided that they were going to use their low tax, low cost labor advantage to attract industry and manufacturing to these states. So, at an initially, many firms found it very lucrative, or so they thought, to move to Alabama or to move to Mississippi because land was almost free. They had huge tax holidays. There were no trade unions. So it seemed like a mecca for manufacturing. But having then set up shop there, very quickly realized that the labor ecosystem didn't exist. So I'll give you an example. Montgomery, Alabama, has a huge Hyundai plant. And when Hyundai built that plant, they built it precisely because of all the financial advantages that it saw. But then they very quickly realized that the only way they could run the plant is by importing labor from Korea, because in Alabama they couldn't find the kind of people you needed to run a highly modern automated manufacturing plant. But then what they did, of course, was they went, they what Hyundai did was, because of the size, the attractive to the U.S. market, they invested in training in the colleges. What do they call them in the U.S.? The community colleges, to revamp their syllabi so that they could then produce the kinds of workers that were needed to service the Hyundai manufacturing ecosystem. So this is a problem. Some years ago, Boeing moved its manufacturing from well, they still have their manufacturing up in Painfield, but they set up a parallel manufacturing plant in South Carolina. I think in Charleston. I forget now, but in South Carolina, and very quickly realized that the quality of products that were coming out of this line were not the same because the work culture was very different. The training was very different. So you had a situation where one of Boeing's very big customers, Qatar Airways, decided that in the future, if they were going to buy 787s or continue their supply of 787s from Boeing, they were only going to buy aircraft that came out of the manufacturing plant in Painfield, not the ones that were coming from the second plant, because they had all kinds of quality problems. So this is something to be considered in India. I'm sure some manufacturers will relocate to India, but if one has the kinds of problems that Foxconn has had recently, or the others, this is going to be a real issue. Uh,
I'd
I'll stop
say
here.
that's really, yeah, and I'd say that's really spot on. And I think there's the challenge lies. So, for example, let's take a hedge assumption. So, of course, as far as there was something called the ease of doing business, now that doesn't exist anymore because that index itself has its own share of issues. But at an Indian level, Uttar Pradesh is definitely becoming a very entrepreneur friendly state now, as far as Niti Aayog's data is concerned, as far as I know. But to
But
say
people,
that,
people
yeah.
forget that Uttar Pradesh is one of the highest contributors to the GST and tax pool. But the problem is not that. The problem is it's all, well, it's spreading out now, but historically it's all been clustered around Noida.
Yes, and it's
That's
still,
been the challenge, right? It's the other places that are now building
yeah,
out.
exactly, and it's still because Noida is a part of Delhi NCR. So inevitably, the dominant startups ecosystem is in Delhi, right? And the IT jobs are also in mostly in Noida and Greater Noida, Faridabad, that particular cluster. I mean, I am yet to see much of it in Purvanchal. Not IT sector job, but something else, something like in manufacturing or something. I
But
mean, I'm
this
not
goes to
expecting.
it goes to the
Yeah.
issue of manufacturing, $200 shirts, 200 rupee, 200, not $200. They make $200 shirts everywhere, but manufacturing 200 rupee shirts, or three
Yeah.
hundred 300 rupee trousers. If if if
Hmm.
if if somehow the state governments and the central government could work to create this
Hmm.
kind, manufacturing of these kinds of products in places like
Hmm.
Purvanchal or in Bihar, you wouldn't
Hmm.
have as many people applying for railway jobs, right? Class D railway jobs.
Hmm. Yes. Yes. And I think I am still yet to see if UP can in future compete, with Maharashtra, Gujarat, Tamil Nadu, and Karnataka, and to an extent even Telangana and Andhra Pradesh, as far as their manufacturing capacities are concerned, their potential and their pros are concerned. If their UP breaks something, well, yes, we can say that Maharashtra is a past story or Tamil Nadu is a past story, but currently, no, it's not. Tamil Nadu is also doing well, and I mean, I am a UPite myself, but I'm just like, if something good is happening, I expect more, and I think
Absolutely.
we should always.
And I
So,
think
yeah.
you should always keep your eye on Bengal and think about what not to do, what to avoid.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think Bengal is a unique case after all, and I really wish that
you
it
know,
undergoes some better transformation. But
10 or
yeah.
12 years ago, or maybe even earlier, Amartya Lahiri, who teaches at the University of British Columbia, wrote a very interesting paper comparing per capita incomes
Hmm.
between Bengal and Maharashtra. And even into the mid to late 50s, Bengal had a much higher per capita income than Maharashtra did. I think it was at its, immediately after independence, I think it was 10 or 12% higher than Maharashtra's per capita income. Uh, Today, it is 35% lower than Maharashtra's per capita income. So, if
Hmm.
you, so I think every state should be mindful of that. What not to do.
Yes, and indeed, I think India's federalism has a very important role in shaping India's international opportunities and priorities. So let's come on to Northeast for a while, and where there we can conclude this dialogue to say that we have day one ended for GLAC. So or Glacon. So we see that under Assam, the Northeast, of course, can use the Siliguri corridor in a reasonable way, and a much development can happen. But there are states like Arunachal, Mizoram, and we are yet to see if sustainable practices can come in for better jobs and better opportunities. Now, one thing which is being tried in the Northeast is, and there was a cabinet meeting for it, and in the union government, I think under Prime Minister Modi, it was agreed that I think palm oil will be extracted from the Northeast somehow, and that work will happen. Now, people criticize that that might have its own unsustainability and so forth. So there are certain things which the government does, and I'll now go a little bit to aesthetics for fun because I'm trying to make an analogy. So, for example, the Deepotsav happened in Ayodhya days before Deepavali, and also the beating retreat happened today for the Republic Day, 73rd Republic Day. But the most peculiar thing which we saw in both of these events, especially the event for Kashi Vishwanath Dham, was the laser show, which has been
Oh, I
discussed
see.
very widely. Yeah, so very widely discussed on social media, and that matters. Why? Because I'm making an analogy here. So I'm saying that, like the laser show was a cringe. As an addition, of course, it might aspire people. You know what? It's so. claimy, it's a beautiful and all of that. But practically in aesthetics, it doesn't contribute that much. But that can be debated afterwards, aesthetically. But what I'm trying to say here is that are we seeing um, the Northeast being subjected to those kind of economic reforms and practices, which of course helps the people there. I mean, we need jobs there. We also need opportunities there, and it needs to be more properly connected with the country. After all, but do you see, in a very honest note, on a very honest note, some sort of ambiguation in that, what, that fine, yes, there is some linkage being created, there are sustainable projects which are starting. I'm pretty sure that as far as the former Asia Pacific construct was concerned in the Indo Pacific, which is to say India's cooperation with Bangladesh, Myanmar, Thailand, in that aspect, yes, northeastern states are pretty doing it well, and the union government is concerned for it. But overall, from a perspective of opportunities and sustainable economy, do you see the Northeast doing well? And if yes, and then what way?
Or, that's very difficult to answer that question. What do I see for the future? I don't know. But, I mean, one of the handicaps in the Northeast for years was a lack of connectivity, which goes back to the first issue you started with infrastructure. And my grandfather was a meteorologist, and he used to travel extensively in the Northeast in the 1930s. And in the only way to get around in those days was by boat, because there were no roads. And for 50 years afterwards, it was the same. There were very, very few roads. And to use an old term that was used to about the Northeast, it was really treated as an astrological zoo with zero development. But these people are, if indeed you consider them your countrymen, you should give to them the same opportunities that people in other parts of the country have. And so the northeastern economies should be integrated, should be, and this is something that has happened rather belatedly. I mean, there's no reason why Itanagar doesn't have a function. I think that they're now building an airport in Itanagar. Just it's ridiculous that this this is not something that's been done prior. I think the Northeast has a lot of potential, both in terms of providing what do you call that? Sustainable development in two ways. One is as repositories of sort of ecological tourism, which I think is very, very important. But also, I think in terms of being a source of uh, uh, sustainable power projects, run of the river type power projects. In terms of palm oil, I think that remains to be seen how much how much it takes off. But I think just making the Northeast more accessible to people from other parts of the country in a way that is in a way that's sustainable. I think that's important in giving a boost to the economies of the Indian states in the Northeast. I don't know if that answers your question, but probably
Yeah,
not.
yeah. But I think it was no. I'll not say completely convincing, but I would say intriguing to churn more in future discussions. So, yeah. I think let's await as the 2022 budget session begins, and let's see how those developments come in. Maybe we can have a follow up on that as well. I mean, I don't know, but till then, I would say that we very well concluded this quote unquote dialogue, which was actually a panel for Glucon 2022. It was a privilege to have you, Rupakji, and I would be very happy to host you for Internationalism Global Podcast, whether for IndusSync or Global Hint, and let's see what awaits. Um, would be a pleasure to host you again, and till then,
Thank you,
tomorrow to
everyone. This
everyone.
was a nice discussion. It's again, I preface all of this by saying this is not my area of expertise. I mean, I know something about India because I've worked. I grew up there and I work professionally with various in various capacities there. But I enjoyed this very much. It was, but you got my perspective rather than multiple perspectives.
Yeah, indeed, and I think that perspective it also has its own distinctive value. So, yeah, certainly a
Thank you
pleasure to
very much.
host you. Yeah.